6-year-old Doratha stood with every muscle straining to the limit. At this critical moment, she was trying mightily to make herself as heavy as possible. She was of very slight build, light-colored hair, bleached even lighter by hours spent in the summer sun. Her light wispy hair contrasted with her brown suntanned skin. She, her 5 older siblings, and parents lived at the family ranch during the summer and then moved back to their home in Orderville during the fall and winter so that the children could attend school. There were 4 boys and her older sister Clara. Dot, as she was called by her family and those who knew her well, was helping her brother, who was roughly 2 years older, set some animal traps they had found in the back of the shed. Following her brothers around the ranch was what Dot lived for. It didn't matter that she often ended up being the butt of their endless pranks or the test pilot of the many inventions they dreamed up. Today, she and her brother Voy were intent on trapping squirrels that were invading the family garden. They had already managed to set 2 or 3 traps and had carefully set them aside, but the springs of the traps they were working on now was particularly stiff. Dot's job was to stand on the springs of the trap with her bare feet while Voy slipped the tongue of the trap into place and adjusted the trigger plate to prepare the traps for business. Suddenly, Dot lost her balance, falling backwards, something she really didn't want to do because she was intent on showing Voy that she was capable of being a big help. As she fell, she reached back with both hands to catch herself and break the fall. Snap! Snap! 2 traps, previously set, snapped painfully shut on her hands and arms. Surprised, hurting, and helpless, she pled through her tears for her older brother to rescue her. He stood up, walked around her slowly, and thoughtfully assessed the situation before he finally stood on the springs of each trap and helped release her hands from its grips. Such was the life of young Doratha living on the ranch with her parents Benny H. and Harriet Bowers Sorensen. She would much rather be outdoors with her brothers Burke, Ray, Mont, and Voy than in the house helping her mother and sister Clara with housework. When Dot was 6 years old, the family was surprised with a new baby brother that they had named Hugh. She loved her kid brother, and although he replaced her as the baby of the family, they became best friends as the older siblings matured and began to leave the household. Dot and Hugh ran barefoot and carefree through the fields and foothills of the ranch, and little did she realize what life had in store for her in the next few years. Doratha was born December 8, 1923, and since her mother was very ill during the first few months of her life, she was primarily cared for by her sister Clara and Aunt Valet, her father's youngest sister. She attended the schools near Orderville, first the Rock Elementary School that stood near the wash where the Valley High parking area is now, then later the high school that was farther up the hill. Dot remembered particularly her 18th birthday. It was Sunday, the 7th of December, and her friend had invited her at sacre meeting to go to the cafe across the street for a hamburger to celebrate her birthday, which was the next day on Monday. As they entered the cafe, the staff and customers were crying and upset. When they asked what was wrong, they were told that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor that morning and that President Roosevelt had declared war on Japan, thrusting the U.S. into World War II. Dot graduated from Valley High School the next spring on May 1st, 1942. Most of the boys her age went directly into the military, which also included her 2 brothers Mont and Voy, who had both graduated in prior years. Wanting to contribute to the war efforts and wanting a job, she left within a few days after graduation to California to live with her sister Clara and her brother Ray, who had been sharing an apartment and working there for some time. Dot got a job working for Douglas Aircraft Company, working on an aircraft assembly line riveting wings on bombers and other military aircraft-related projects. She stayed and worked in California for 18 months, but started having health problems and became very homesick. In the fall of 1943, she returned to her parents' home in Orderville. She worked at the Orderville Co-op store for a period of time after she began feeling better. Some of Dot's friends had gone to Salt Lake City to work and were staying at the historical Lion House, so sometime in the summer of 1945 she moved to Salt Lake. She states that she moved to Salt Lake after VJ Day, which is August 15th, 1945, and worked at a steam laundry establishment where she learned many things. She also worked at the Lion House. Since they also catered parties and dinners, they gave the girls who lived there an opportunity to work, cooking in the kitchen and serving the guests. One experience she had there was serving dinner to a group of LDS church leaders, and during the course of their dinner, she nearly dropped a bowl of hot soup on President Heber J. Grant's head. She had quick hands, however, and thankfully caught the soup in mid-flight. Dot does not say in her biography how long she lived in Salt Lake, but she was there when Voy mustered out of the army and rode the bus home with him for a visit with the family. She was also there when Mont came home from Europe and mustered out of the military. She mentions that Voy came to Salt Lake to pick Mont up, and they had a great reunion. Dot again moved to southern Utah because by the summer or fall of 1947 she was living in Cedar City and working at the Whatcot's Candy Kitchen. Dot's first cousin, Elna Covington, had married Orland Howe, and they were also living in Cedar City, where Orland drove truck for Garrett Freight Line. Elna told Dot frequently that Orland had a young friend that he worked with at the trucking company that he wanted her to meet. Elna and Orland made arrangements for Dot and the young driver from Paragouna to have dinner with them at their home, and that was the first time Dot and Clayton met. Around the end of 1947, Dot had again moved back to Orderville. Letters from Clayton and Dot have survived to provide evidence that they courted mostly through letter writing, with only a couple trips mentioned when she went to Paragouna and traveled to Orderville to meet each other's families. He mentioned in one letter in February 1948 purchasing a sofa and some other household items that he hoped she would like. Dot and Clayton were married in the St. George Temple on May 1st, 1948, and set up housekeeping in a rented home just across the street west of the elementary school in Paragouna. They didn't waste any time getting underway with the construction of their own home, just 3 blocks south of the rental home, on a building lot given to them by Clayton's parents. Clayton excavated the basement using a team of draft horses and a Fresno scraper. They moved into their new home on October 11th, 1948. Even though it wasn't completely finished, but it had a roof and walls and a wood and coal stove for heat. The winter of 1948 and 49 was one of the coldest and snowiest in history, and for much of the time the US 91 highway over Black Ridge south of Cedar City was drifted over and closed, so Clayton and the other Garrett drivers couldn't even get home. It was a cold, lonely winter for Dot, and she was dealing with a new experience since she was expecting her first son. On June 10th, 1949, Clayton arrived home from work just in time to take Dot to the hospital in Cedar City for the arrival of their first son, Dylan. She says that she was never lonely after that. 2 years later, on July 25th, 1951, Kyle was born, so now she had 2 boys to keep her company and her hands very full. Almost 3 years later, Craig was born, May 24th, 1954. By then, the home they had started together was finished with a coal furnace, insulation, finishing trim, flooring, and nice furnishings. They were rightfully proud of what they had accomplished, all with no debt. As summer turned into fall, Clayton and his brother Scott made plans to go deer hunting. They had not been hunting since they had left together to serve 5 years in the military. They invited Burns Sherritt, a fellow Garrett driver, and his 16-year-old son Lee to go with them. Clayton also invited his 16-year-old nephew, Roger Skogard, to go with them. Roger's mother, Eunice, Clayton and Scott's sister, had lost her husband and Roger's father in a traffic train accident in the iron mines west of Cedar City 4 years earlier. The party left on their hunting trip early in the morning of October 23, 1954, with plans to go up Red Creek Canyon east of Paragouna and hunt near the Red Creek Reservoir. Clayton had promised he would take Deland and Kyle with him and take them into the mountains hunting on the following Monday. Dot had a full day planned since she had promised Bertha Topham, a widow down the street, she would drive her to Cedar for some business, since Bertha had a car but had never learned to drive. As they were leaving Cedar, they stopped at Bertha's daughter's home before returning to Paraguna and were told about a new report that a hunter had been shot in the mountains east of Paraguna. Dot said that a lone black cloud hung over the mountains east of Paraguna as she mentioned it to Bertha, but didn't give it too much more thought. As soon as she got home, she went and ordered new garments from the sister in the ward, who was the distribution representative, to confirm to her that her fears were unfounded. That evening, after the boys were fed and Dot was feeding Craig in his high chair, there was a knock at the door, and Scott, Burns, and the county sheriff walked into the living room. In an instant, Dorotha's whole world changed as she learned that her husband of 6½ years and the father of her 3 boys had been struck by a stray bullet and had died on the mountain. Dot said many times that the support of her family made it possible to survive the dark days after the tragedy, and that the blessing given to her that night by Grandpa Sorensen and her brothers was the medicine she needed.
One of the things that I remember about my childhood that is very sacred to me and makes me appreciate my mother very much was the day that her husband and our father was killed. It was in October, and he had decided to go deer hunting. He went with his brother, a friend at work, Burns Sherritt was his name, and a nephew, Eunice's son, Roger Skogard, and Burns Sherritt's 16-year-old son, Lee Sherritt. They had decided to go deer hunting. My father said that he hadn't hunted deer since he came home from the military, which was about 6 years ago at that point in time, 7 years ago. And they decided to form this party and go deer hunting up near Paraguna Reservoir, just south of the reservoir. And my mother says in her biography that she had been asked by Bertha Topham, who was a widow lady that lived just down the street from us, to take her to Cedar City. And as she was returning with Bertha and us, the boys, in Bertha's car, she said that she heard on the radio that there had been a deer hunter that had been injured in the mountains east of Paraguna. At that point in time, there was hundreds of California deer hunters that came out of California, but so she kind of dismissed the thought that maybe her husband had been injured. But as she drove from Cedar City to Paraguna, she noticed a huge black cloud hanging over the hills east of Paraguna. In fact, I was going to read from her journal. As we came out of Cedar and went north toward Paraguna, there was the biggest, blackest cloud I had ever seen hanging right over the hills east of Paraguna. I mentioned it to Bertha, but it didn't seem to register with her. I know later that should have been an omen to me, but I dismissed it as well. But as soon as I got home in Paraguna, I went down to a lady's house and ordered some garments for myself and for Clayton. In other words, she was moving on. But that evening, and I can remember this distinctly, that evening as we were having supper, and I think my mom was feeding Craig, sitting on a stool in front of his high chair. We heard a knock at the door, and then without us responding to the knock or my mom going to the door, my uncle, Scott Barton, the county sheriff, I didn't know him, and Burns Sherritt, whom I did know, walked in the front door. And my mom knew immediately. I remember her reaction. She started crying, and of course there was a lot of emotion in the room at that point in time. She had questions, but there were really no answers to really any of her questions. And then she started talking to us, Kyle and myself. Craig was only 5 months old, and tried to explain to us what had happened. None of the impact, none of the importance of that day really registered with us, I'm sure. But I couldn't imagine the impact that had on our mother. She immediately started trying to get a hold of family. We had a telephone, but apparently she couldn't get a hold of Grandpa and Grandma. She finally got a hold of Aunt Beth by calling the store in Orderville and having them go get Aunt Beth from the cafe next door. And she was able to contact her family that way. I'm sure I went to bed, but later that evening, Uncle Voy came. He was in Orderville and had been deer hunting, and he was on his way home, and so he stopped by. Then Grandpa and Grandma and Burke and Beth and Aunt Clara came to our house. I don't remember how long they stayed, but I do know that Aunt Clara stayed for a few days, and trying to give my mom the support she needed. The rest of that event was a blur to me. I do remember the funeral. I remember the viewing was held in our home. We have a picture of my father in his casket laying in our living room. And that's how that was done in those days. The viewing was held in our home, and then later the services were held in the church. And I remember that part of it, and I remember the cemetery, the military gun salute that was given, because my father had served for 5 years in the military. He did have a military service. I remember the flowers mounded up on the grave. And all of those things remind me what a tremendous load of responsibility that was transferred to my mother's shoulders. I know I didn't respect that load as much as I should have, but that she said that she realized at that point in time how poorly prepared she was to provide the means for a family, but we were able to make it thanks to her financial management ability, and but that is a memory that I have that I want my posterity to know and understand. Thank you.
The family continued living in their home in Paraguna for several years. Dylan and then Kyle started school in the old Paraguna Elementary, but during the summer of 1958, Dot made the decision to sell the home in Paraguna and move the family back to her hometown of Orderville, where she would have the nearby emotional and moral support of her parents and family.
Okay, I'd like to tell you a story about Grandma Barton. We had a little family outing up at Navajo Lake. I was very young, probably 6 or 7. I remember we had Uncle Hugh's boat up there. I think Lee was the driver of the boat at the time. Anyway, they wanted Mother to go skiing. And I'm sure it was July or August at Navajo Lake. The lake is very cold. And so she decided that she could take off from the dock and not get in the water to take off. And she did, and she went clear around the lake, and they crossed the wake a time or two trying to dump her in the lake, and she never did go down. And they circled 2 or 3 times, and then they brought her back to shore, and she come right into shore, stepped out of the skis at the shore, and never got her swimming suit wet. And they tried to get her to go again, and she says, "No way, I'm not going to go again," because they would do something to dump her in the lake. And so she wouldn't go again, and to show them how good she really was.
The family lived with Grandpa and Grandma Sorensen for a while, but soon bought the Hoyt home that stood just south of the LDS church and on the same block as Grandpa and Grandma's home. About the same time that Craig started school, Dot became the manager of the school lunch program at the Valley Schools and kept that job until after Craig graduated from high school in 1972. After Craig graduated from high school, Dot moved to St. George and lived with Grandpa and Grandma Sorensen at their little house in St. George, where they lived during the winter months, just 3 houses west of the temple on 400 South. First, Dot worked at the Wenzel sewing plant making sleeping bags, tents, backpacks, and other outdoor gear. During this time, she made many vests and sleeping bags for many of the family. She enjoyed her work, but found that every time the work at the plant slowed down, they would lay everyone off and she would be out of a paycheck until the work revived again. So she began looking for something more stable. The St. George Temple had been closed for about 2 years for a major remodel with an addition of the annex with a kitchen, office, and other areas. When the time came near for the temple to reopen, she applied for the job as manager of the food service in the temple and was hired. She began work early enough that she was able to help with some of the design work in the kitchen area. The temple was reopened and rededicated in November of 1975. Dot loved her work at the temple and making the guests and patrons feel at home in the dining area, where she made fresh cinnamon rolls and bread to go along with the lovely meals she and the staff provided. In December of 1988, when she reached 65 years of age, Dot retired from the temple with the desire to go on a mission. In March of 1989, Dot left to serve a mission in the Washington, D.C. South Mission. She had many great experiences and learned to love the members in West Virginia and Virginia. She said that some of her companions were a bit of a trial, but some of them she grew to love very much. When she returned home, she determined to serve another 1-year mission at the Family History Center in Salt Lake City. In the summer of 1991, she rented a little studio apartment on First North within walking distance of downtown Salt Lake and the Family History Center. She loved the activities such as concerts, plays, and recitals, and was very busy every night after her work as a missionary. In 1992, she returned home from Salt Lake. She did some painting and fixing up of her home in Orderville and put on a new roof in St. George and began migrating between the 2 homes depending on the weather. She became a snowbird, and she also enjoyed traveling. She toured the Holy Land, went to Hawaii, traveled to Boston with Ray, traveled to Europe and toured Austria, Germany, and Holland with Delenn and Charlene. If anyone was going anywhere, she was game to go along. She liked to take the grandkids fishing on the stream above Glendale during the summer. After Thanksgiving, and as Christmas was approaching in 1997, Dot was taking her usual evening walk around the area of her home in St. George. She was crossing the street at the southwest corner of the temple and was struck by a careless driver in an old pickup truck. She called her son Lynn from the hospital, and he drove immediately from Cedar City to St. George and spent most of the night with her. She was angry, hurt, and frightened all at the same time. Her knee just below the joint was shattered. Dr. Johnson operated the next day and repaired the knee joint as best he could, but hesitated to say that she would be able to walk on that leg. After a few days' stay in the hospital, she moved to a rehab facility in St. George. Dot celebrated her 74th birthday in the rehab center. Then about a week before Christmas, she was able to go with Lynn and his family for Christmas and continued the outpatient physical therapy in Cedar City. After about 2 months of physical therapy, they had done about all they could do for Dot's recovery, but she still struggled to move about on a walker and seemed to have lost a lot of her zest for life. It occurred to Lynn and Charlene that Dot was becoming more and more dependent on them and the children they still had at home, so they suggested she try going back to her home in St. George. The thought frightened her, and she expressed many reasons why she couldn't live by herself, but after a few discussions, it was determined that she would go back to St. George. The day Lynn and Charlene drove her to St. George, she still had major reservations, but when they showed her how she could navigate the steps both on the front porch and on the back porch of the house using her walker, she decided she would try it out for a while. Within a few weeks, she was back to her old independent, can-do spirit and took great pride in moving around with a cane and then no aid at all. She had wonderful neighbors and friends that checked her regularly until she was getting around almost as well as before the accident. Just a couple of years after her accident, Dot was diagnosed with breast cancer. She underwent radical mastectomy of her right breast and radiation therapy that left her weak and struggling with her health again. On several occasions, she had to be admitted to the hospital for treatments resulting from the radiation therapy. Finally, she seemed to be back to her normal health again and began to enjoy some of the activities she had so richly deserved as the years flew by. Dot very rarely complained of pain, but during the winter of 2005 and 2006, she began mentioning pains in her shoulder and back. Her family took her to a series of doctors in St. George and got really nothing to explain the pain she was having except prescriptions for more medications, which she really disliked because of the side effects. That spring, she was able to move up to her home in Orderville with the help of Kyle and Suzanne and spent the summer with them, checking on her daily and providing meals and transportation. Later, during a visit with Lynn's family in Cedar City, she had a very serious pain attack and she was taken to the emergency room in the night. The emergency room doctor, Dr. Jeff Blazard, happened to be a personal friend of Lynn and Charlene. After examining Dot, he took Lynn and Charlene aside and told them that he believed that Dot had a serious case of bone cancer, but couldn't be sure, and suggested they obtain a full-body bone scan to determine where and what extent the cancer had spread. The bone scan confirmed their worst fears. The bone cancer had spread through much of her body and was causing the frequent pains she was experiencing. That prognosis was finally given to Dot in August of 2006. From that point on, she stayed with Lynn and Charlene and their family, who tried desperately to keep her as comfortable as possible under the guidance of hospice until October 4th, 2006, when she passed away. Her funeral was held in Orderville on Saturday, October 7th, 2006, and she was buried in the Paraguna Cemetery next to her husband Clayton Lyman Barton, where they were reunited again after almost 52 years.